Good afternoon. Welcome to the session C3 at the ASFPM conference. My name is Del Schwalz. I am the president of Schwalz Consulting and also your Region 4 director. Thank you for making it through to the last session of the first day. I hope you've all enjoyed the presentations. Today's session is on building science and floodproofing. And I want to thank our sponsor today, Atkins. Once again, we cannot do this without our sponsors. So thank you so much, Atkins, for sponsoring this conference and this session. Right off the bat, we're going to start with our first presentation. This is Manny Perotin. Manny is a project manager with CDM Smith, and Manny's presentation is on giving multifamily buildings a new lease on life from flooding. So Manny, welcome to the stage.
Good afternoon. I am Manny Perotin, and I hope to provide you an overview of a publication we helped the FEMA Floodplain Management Division develop last year. Note, I am a FEMA contractor, so with the permission of the Floodplain Management Division, I am presenting one of our final deliverables. While the publication is not currently available for download or in print from the warehouse, you can reach out to the FEMA Floodplain Management Division for a digital copy. The division is coordinating with FEMA External Affairs to have this available on their website. I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the staff who contributed to the development of this publication. I know the FEMA Floodplain Management Division at headquarters was planning to listen into this presentation, and if I cannot answer your questions at the end, they are listening, so you may want to follow up with them afterwards. With respect to questions, please include the slide number when asking questions in the chat, as this should help me with quickly referencing the content and addressing your question. In the publication and this presentation, multifamily buildings refer to buildings with 5 or more dwelling units. This is not a formal definition across floodplain management, just for the purposes of this publication. The buildings typically have 4 or more stories above ground and may have 1 or more floors below ground. The term includes condominiums, apartment buildings, in addition to congregate residences such as nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and dormitories. A dwelling unit is a single unit designed or intended to be used for human habitation, providing independent living facilities for 1 or more persons, including permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation facilities. The figure on the right is a representative of a multifamily building, and figure 1-1 from the publication. Note, neither of these terms are defined in the CFR nor the flood insurance manual. The overall purpose of the publication is to provide guidance on developing a comprehensive mitigation approach to multifamily buildings. In order to develop that approach, it is important to be knowledgeable of the applicable floodplain management requirements, the process for determining flood risk, as well as potential mitigation measures to address that risk. The publication and this presentation generally focus on the retrofits, but are applicable to newly constructed buildings as well. To provide an overview of the publication, the first half of this presentation addresses key terms in the regulatory framework. This will include how to determine the correct building designation and the minimum NFIP requirements, including some guidance regarding mixed-use buildings. And the second half will address insurance considerations, potential mitigation measures, and the development of a mitigation strategy. I already defined multifamily buildings and dwelling units. Let us continue with defining some additional key terms as defined in section 1.4 of the publication. Existing construction is a structure built before the community had adopted a flood insurance rate map. New construction is a structure built after the community's adoption of floodplain management regulations. In addition, structures which have been substantially improved or substantially damaged are also considered new construction. For floodplain management regulatory purposes, the definition of new construction may conflict with the building code definition. Both of these terms, existing and new construction, are defined in the 44 CFR Part 59.1. The term legal nonconforming construction is not defined in the CFR and refers to structures that were initially built under existing floodplain management regulations as enforced by the community and become legal nonconforming when there are changes to those requirements. For example, the flood zone that the building is located within changes to a more restricted zone, say Zone A becomes Zone V, and the foundation, the enclosure, or the minimum elevation no longer comply with the new floodplain management requirements. There is an increase to the BFE that exceeds the elevation requirements to which the building was constructed, or there are just simply more restrictive floodplain management requirements. In legal nonconforming construction, there can be no modifications to the building that will no longer make it compliant with the adopted local floodplain management ordinance requirements that were enforced at the time of original construction. In the event that the building is substantially improved or the building becomes substantially damaged, the building must be brought into compliance with the current requirements. The terms residential, non-residential, and other residential buildings are not defined in the CFR. However, the terms are defined in the flood insurance manual. For flood insurance purposes, an other residential building is defined as a building that is designed for use as a residential space for 5 or more families, or a mixed-use building in which the total floor area devoted to non-residential use is less than 25% of the total floor area within the building. A residential building is a building designated for habitation, whereas a non-residential building is a building that has a commercial or other non-residential use. The flood insurance manual defines a mixed-use building as a building that has both residential and non-residential uses. Mixed-use buildings create unique circumstances when considering flood mitigation approaches, because the floodplain management requirements are applied to specific portions of the building based on whether the portions are used for residential or non-residential purposes. Figure 1-4 on the right is considered a mixed-use building as it has both residential and non-residential uses. Multifamily residential buildings normally include ancillary uses such as lobbies, foyers, offices used by building management, and mailrooms for residents. It also includes common areas used by residents for non-residential purposes such as parking, storage, offices, meeting rooms, swimming pools, and exercise facilities. From a floodplain management perspective, buildings with multiple dwelling units and ancillary use areas that support the dwelling units are not considered mixed-use buildings, so the entire building is considered residential. In Figure 1-5, the building on the right is not considered mixed use, as it only has residential uses. Let's highlight some key differences in how floodplain management and flood insurance consider mixed-use buildings. The building in Figure 1-4 is a 5-story building with commercial retail space at grade level and residential dwelling units in the 4 stories above. For floodplain management purposes, the building is considered a mixed-use building. For the purposes of flood insurance, since the commercial portion of the building is less than 25% of the total building area, the building is considered an other residential building. Although the commercial portion of the mixed-use structure can be dry floodproof for floodplain management purposes, a floodproofing certificate under the flood insurance provisions is not available. The building on the left in Figure 1-5 is a 6-story building with commercial uses on the first and second story and residential dwelling units on the 4 stories above. For the purposes of floodplain management, the building is considered a mixed-use building. For flood insurance purposes, since the commercial portion of the building is 25% or greater of the total building area, the building is considered a non-residential business. The building on the right in Figure 1-5 is a 4-story residential building with building access from ground level. For purposes of floodplain management and flood insurance, the building is considered a residential building. Additional terms used throughout the publication include the lowest floor, which is defined in the CFR as the floor of the lowest enclosed area, including the basement. An unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure, usable solely for parking of vehicles, building access, or storage, in an area other than a basement area is not considered a building's lowest floor, provided that such an enclosure is not built so as to render the structure in violation of the applicable non-elevation design requirements. A flood mitigation strategy is described as a comprehensive approach to help protect a building from flood damage. Included in a flood mitigation strategy is a vulnerability assessment, determination of a flood protection elevation or level, and utilization of one or more mitigation measures to help minimize flood damage. The flood protection level is the elevation of flood protection that a building will be retrofitted to resist. This level is determined either by requirements in the NFIP, requirements in the building code, or a locally adopted ordinance and used in design of any retrofits to building and utility systems. In addition, when owners and designers elect to provide a degree of protection greater than the minimum required, the flood protection level refers to the elevation selected above the minimum required. Now that we've gone over some key terms, let's go over the regulatory framework. Floodplain management regulations cover all residential buildings and apply to single-family dwellings as well as multifamily buildings. Although most multifamily buildings are structurally similar to commercial buildings, unless a multifamily building is mixed use, it would be treated as residential under the National Flood Insurance Program. Therefore, mitigation measures available to commercial and other non-residential buildings, such as dry floodproofing, are not permitted for new construction or substantially improved multifamily buildings or residential portions of mixed-use buildings. We will start the regulatory framework with how to determine the building designations outlined in the key terms portion of this presentation. As a reminder, existing construction is a structure built before the community had adopted a flood insurance rate. New construction is a structure built after the community's adoption of floodplain management regulations. Legal nonconforming construction refers to structures that were initially built under existing floodplain management regulations as enforced by the community that then become legal nonconforming due to changes in floodplain management requirements. Remember, there can be no modifications to these buildings that will make them no longer compliant with the adopted local floodplain management requirements that were enforced at the time of construction. Figure 2-1 assists with determining a building designation as well as the applicable floodplain management requirements. A key step in identifying the building designation is identifying when the community joined the National Flood Insurance Program. A critical resource for this is the NFIP Community Status Book. Here you can find the community as well as the date the community joined the National Flood Insurance Program. Existing construction predominantly includes construction built prior to the community joining the National Flood Insurance Program, but also includes structures that were built outside the effective special flood hazard area at the time of construction. New construction means that the building was constructed after the community joined the National Flood Insurance Program, including substantially damaged and substantially improved structures. In addition, it means the building meets the current floodplain management requirements within that community. Legal nonconforming construction means that the building was constructed in compliance with the floodplain management requirements in effect when permitted, but the BFE, flood zone, or other floodplain management requirements have changed since. Determining the building designation is critical to identifying the applicable floodplain management requirements. If the building designation is existing construction, unless the structure is being substantially improved or was substantially damaged, then conformance with current floodplain management requirements is not required. If the building designation is new construction, including substantial improvement or substantial damage, then the structure must conform with the current floodplain management requirements. Finally, if the building designation is legal nonconforming, unless the structure is being substantially improved or was substantially damaged, then conformance with current floodplain management requirements is not required. However, any retrofit measures cannot make the structure less compliant with floodplain management regulations in effect at the time it was constructed or date of previous substantial improvement. For example, a post-firm dry flood-proofed office building located in the special flood hazard area at the time of construction cannot be converted to a residential building because dry flood proofing of a residential building would not have been permissible at the time of construction. Once the building designation determination has been made, the flood zone must be determined. The flood zone is important to determine so that the correct construction performance standards are considered in the mitigation. The determination can be made by looking at the flood insurance rate. The NFIP has specific performance requirements for new construction that depend on the flood zone location of the building. For example, the elevation and foundation requirements differ within Zone A versus V. In addition, the allowance of dry flood proofing of non-residential buildings is prohibited in Zone V. Table 2-1 in the publication provides a summary of allowable measures based on the building occupancy, residential, non-residential, or mixed use. The next few slides apply the allowances described in Table 2-1 to representative buildings. Note, although NFIP regulations do not explicitly address mixed-use buildings, FEMA guidance indicates non-residential portions of mixed-use buildings may be dry flood proofed, although some limitations apply. Figure 2-2 represents a residential building designed and constructed within the lowest floor in compliance with floodplain management requirements. Remember, the lowest floor is defined as the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area. In this figure, the lowest floor is at the base flood elevation. Figure 2-3 represents an apartment building with building access, storage, and parking for residents at ground level. The ground floor complies with NFIP floodplain management requirements if it is built with flood damage-resistant materials, has flood openings designed to allow the automatic entry and exit of floodwater, and the use of enclosed area remains limited to access, storage, and parking. This configuration and use of areas is allowed when NFIP compliance is required, whether for new construction, substantial improvements, or to make the building compliant after the building is substantially damaged. Figure 2-5 represents a mixed-use building with a commercial retail space, a restaurant, and access to the residential dwellings on the ground floor. The building does not have a basement, and all the dwelling units and areas that support the residents are located above the BFE. For mixed-use buildings, lobby areas that serve both the residential and non-residential areas may be dry flood proof, provided there is a separate building access area that serves the dwelling units above the BFE. This access area must either be elevated above the BFE or wet flood proofed, having flood damage-resistant materials, and meet all other applicable requirements of the local floodplain management ordinance. Note the exterior stairs illustrated in Figure 2-5 are essential in meeting the floodplain management requirement within a mixed-use building, as a non-residential areas may be dry flood-proofed, provided there is a separate building access area that serves the dwelling units above the BFE that is either elevated or wet flood-proofed. Figure 2-4 represents an existing construction residential building with a mailroom, management office, and exercise room on the ground floor. It does not have a basement, and all the apartments and dwelling units are located above the BFE. If the proposed work does not constitute substantial improvement or repair of substantial damage, which would trigger compliance with the NFIP requirements for new construction, then below BFE areas may be wet flood-proofed or dry flood-proofed. If NFIP compliance is required, the area below the BFE may only be wet flood-proofed. The configuration and uses of areas below the BFE shown in Figure 2-4 would not be permitted when compliance is required, as areas below the BFE are only permitted to be used for parking, storage, and access when wet flood-proofed. Dry flood-proofing any portion of a residential building below the BFE is not permitted when compliance is required. When NFIP compliance is not required, partial protection of buildings can be achieved using a variety of measures, including wet and dry flood-proofing, repurposing of the ground floor, protection of utility system components, or other measures that provide partial flood protection. Lower cost partial methods of protection include using flood damage resistant materials, implementing utility system component protection, and employing emergency measures such as temporary flood barriers. Especially in areas subject to repetitive low-level flooding, owners may find these approaches beneficial. Now that we've covered key terms and hopefully you have a better understanding of the basic regulatory requirements, I will outline some general flood insurance considerations related to multifamily buildings. The program has three options for the standard flood insurance policy. Depending on the type of ownership, multifamily buildings addressed in this publication will typically qualify either for the general property form or the residential condominium building association policy. For insurance rating purposes, the NFIP has 5 building occupancies. Multifamily buildings addressed in this presentation are typically considered other residential buildings. Factors that influence the NFIP flood insurance premium for multifamily buildings include the flood zone, the structure and foundation type, as well as the elevation of the lowest floor compared to the base flood elevation. Assuming the multifamily building is mixed use and meets all other criteria to receive a dry flood proofing credit under the NFIP, factors that may influence the premium include passive versus active mitigation. In other words, is human intervention necessary to implement the measure? Whether or not the entire building perimeter versus portions is dry flood proofed. The depth of the flood protection measure, or how deep the water is being kept out relative to the lowest adjacent grade, and past performance of the measures. Due to the size of multifamily buildings, mitigation measures to help protect them from flooding may be limited. Traditional mitigation measures typically applied to single-family dwellings, such as an elevation, are often not feasible or cost-prohibitive for large multifamily buildings. Therefore, this publication provides additional mitigation measures to help reduce flood risk. The mitigation portion of the publication highlights measures that comply with floodplain management requirements and that primarily apply to existing buildings. The publication includes building designations for which the mitigation measures are allowed, discusses which flood conditions are most appropriate for the measures, and outlines advantages and disadvantages for each of the mitigation measures. This presentation will highlight less common measures and some secondary considerations. One relatively uncommon measure is the dry flood proofing of utility systems or other critical building components. These vaults combine dry and wet flood proofing techniques, and the measure is allowable for commercial areas within mixed-use buildings and is appropriate for buildings located in areas subject to low-velocity, short-duration floods. Another relatively uncommon approach is to repurpose the lowest floor. Depending on the repurposed use, wet or dry flood proofing techniques are permissible. While the measure is generally effective at reducing flood risk, it can require major structural renovations and/or potential loss of usable space. Some additional secondary mitigation measures include isolating utilities that service the ground floor or areas susceptible to flood damage, installing backflow prevention valves to reduce water entry through the utilities, installing pumps to reduce damage from seepage, applying flood damage-resistant materials in all flood-prone areas, installing emergency power to run pumps or other flood risk reduction measures, and conducting annual exercises to maintain awareness of flood risk and rehearse implementing protective measures. One final resource to highlight from the publication is the development of a mitigation strategy, which is intended to be a comprehensive plan that uses a series of steps to properly plan a mitigation project and give it a higher likelihood of being successfully implemented. The mitigation strategy development steps outlined in Figure 5-7 mirror most of the content I covered today, beginning with a determination of the building designation, either new, legal nonconforming, or existing, and ending with evaluating mitigation measures. One critical step that I did not have sufficient time to emphasize today is conducting a vulnerability assessment. The quality and thoroughness of that assessment is directly related to the likelihood of the mitigation measure being successfully implemented. For those of you not watching this recording during concurrent session C3, my email address is at the bottom of this slide should you have any questions. For those of you watching this part of the concurrent session, I'll turn it over to our virtual producer to facilitate the live Q&A at this time.
Thank you, Mandy. Appreciate you speaking to us today and giving us that presentation. I also, as a Florida guy, appreciate the fact that you're wearing our Florida Conference t-shirt.
They're done virtually, so I thought it was fitting.
There we go. Well, Mandy, we got a few questions. Fantastic presentation. I appreciate it. The first one that came in is, why is elevating a home considered new construction if you're not expanding the blueprint, just changing the construction itself?
Typically, when we're elevating a home, we're most likely triggering what's called substantial improvement. And once we trigger substantial improvement based on our floodplain management regulations, we treat that as if it were new construction.
Excellent. Okay. So it's not considered new construction, it just is treated like for the rebuild.
I think that's a good way of looking at it, yes.
Yeah. So could you provide an update on FEMA's consideration of allowing dry floodproof ancillary residential areas?
Sure, I can talk to that. So as part of our effort, I think I mentioned on this task at the beginning of the presentation, this was done under a task order. We assisted with developing this guidance document. And another deliverable, we created the publication, we created this slides presentation that I used. And then a third part of that was what we call the white paper. And that white paper made recommendations towards potential allowances moving forward. And as I kind of highlighted in the presentation, a lot of these non-residential buildings, especially when you start getting into high rises and things of that nature, are designed and constructed very similar to a commercial building, what we would consider a commercial building, and meet the IBC requirements and things of that nature. So there are some things that were recommended in that white paper for the agency to consider for allowance moving forward. I will say one key component of that is that all dwelling units remain above the BFE. So all I would say the true residential areas, the dwelling units, as well as all the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing services required for those residential units to be habitable also have to be above the BFE. But I think there were some things in there, some leeway, if you would, for parking, and maybe some of the ancillary areas such as a mail room or something along that nature.
Okay, great. Thanks, Martin, for that great question. You answered how you get the guide, which is in the comments section.
Yes, just reach out to the Floodplain Management Division, and I added the email in the chat while we were still on before we entered into the Zoom call.
Great. So the other question would be, with a mixed-use building with a residential lobby below the BFE that needs separate access and above, what counts as separate access?
So I think I covered that. I tried to cover that some. And if you go back to the presentation, it's on slide 27. And specifically, once you get the pub, there's a figure 2-5, and there's actually a set of stairwell there to show you. It actually looks somewhat like an interior stairwell, but it comes down. You can also have an exterior set of stairs, meaning you have a door, let's say at the second floor, and then that brings you down out, along the exterior portion of the building. That would be also acceptable. Ultimately, you have to have some form of egress where the individuals can come downstairs or come out of the building without having to step over a shield or try and walk through a shield for that matter.
Gotcha. Okay. We got another really good question here from Eddie. And what if the state's building code uses 3+ units to define multifamily? Can the guidance still apply?
Yes, it may. I think one of the reasons why we use the 5-unit definition in this case is one of the goals of this publication was trying to help navigate the floodplain management requirements the flood insurance manual guidance or guidelines, as well as some of the things that are in the code, such as FEMA building science guidance, as well as IBC and ASC 24. And that's specifically why we picked 5 units. There's a little bit of, consistency with the insurance manual in particular. But there is a possibility that something with 3 or more units would also be, I would say the guidelines or the principles would be applicable. But depending on the type of design and construction, you may have to adjust some of adjust some of the guidelines that are in this publication.
Okay, great. Well, Manny, it looks like that is all the questions we've got. So I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Manny. We'll see you around this week. So we'll go ahead and get into our next presenter. We've made up a little bit of time here, so we may be able to give a little more time for questions later. Our next presentation is going to be from Jonathan Westcott. And Jonathan is a civil engineer with FEMA's Building Science Branch. Jonathan's presentation today is going to be on building code saves, how the FEMA's nationwide building code losses avoided study. So they're going to be looking at the study they did on the building code losses avoided. So Jonathan, welcome, appreciate it.
Joining us for this virtual presentation, FEMA's Building Code Saves study. I'm Jonathan Westcott, and I'm a civil engineer in FEMA's Building Science Branch and the lead for the study. I'm joined today by Dr. Shane Parson of AECOM, part of the Compass joint venture, who is the lead flood subject matter expert for the study. Next slide. To start, I'm going to give an introduction and explain how this study furthers Goal 3 of the National Mitigation Investment Strategy to make mitigation investment standard practice. Then I'm going to turn it over to Shane, who will give us a study overview, highlight the data we're using, the study methodology, and some of our initial findings before diving into the details of the flood module. He's going to identify some early insights and preliminary findings, but know that the study is still very much ongoing. So lastly, we'll talk about our next steps, which include completing the study later this year. There should be time for questions, or you can visit our virtual Building Science Branch booth during the breaks. I also encourage you to visit our study website, which you can easily find by searching FEMA Building Code Saves, and we'll provide a link at the end of the presentation. Next. FEMA places a strong emphasis on building codes because they enhance public safety and property protection. Model building codes are more disaster resistant than ever. The National Institute of Building Sciences found that adopting modern building codes saves $11 for every $1 invested through earthquake, flood, and wind mitigation efforts, representing avoided casualties, fewer cases of PTSD, reduced property damage, fewer business interruptions, lower insurance premiums, and other benefits. The benefits of strong code adoption and enforcement become evident following disasters. FEMA mitigation assessment teams have documented significant reduction in damages to structures built to modern hazard-resistant codes, most recently following the devastating 2017 hurricane season in Florida and Texas and the Caribbean. Despite the effectiveness of modern building codes, disaster costs are huge and rising and affect tens of millions of Americans. As we spend more and more time in our homes and essential offices, this pandemic just underscores how much we rely on these structures to be safe. Surprisingly to some, about 2/3 of our nation's jurisdictions haven't adopted a recent edition of the model codes. We need to change that in order to maximize their significant benefits. Unfortunately, many communities and the public aren't even aware that they have inferior building codes, a situation our partners at Flash are shining a light on at www.inspecttoprotect.org. Our nation's mitigation investment strategy calls for making mitigation standard practice and recognizes the importance of building codes in making that happen. This study will, for the first time, quantify the losses avoided from the adoption of modern hazard-resistant building codes. With the data and methods available, we're able to use HAZUS to model key structural characteristics of hazard-resistant building codes as they were adopted over time by communities across the country. Buildings constructed with these characteristics, such as Freeboard, for example, experience fewer losses when exposed to hurricane winds, flooding, and/or earthquakes. As with any study of this size, there are limitations, some of which Shane will get into, but we'll ultimately be able to use these results to further Goal 3 of the investment strategy and encourage communities to adopt and enforce up-to-date building codes. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Shane to dive into the details of the study.
All right, thanks a lot, Jonathan. So what I'm going to do is take us through an overview of the study, give you some background on the study and the analysis being done for multiple hazards, and then do a deep dive into the flood-specific analysis. So one of the challenges in really taking on a study of this size and scale is really forming those foundational questions of what are we trying to accomplish. And so one of the big ones is how much money will modern building codes save communities? One of the big criticisms of adopting modern codes is a lot of builders will say it's adding unnecessary additional cost, expense, complexity to the construction of a building without understanding how those additional measures and those additional practices actually lead to losses avoided over time, not just from one hazard, but from multiple hazards, and how over time that actually adds up to being a lower overall cost to a homeowner over the lifetime of a structure. So in order to figure out this sort of dollar amount, we have to come up with a modeling methodology that allows us to look at, from available data sets, how do we kind of get at how to put the dollars to codes. So one part of it is understanding that codes do impact multiple hazards. So what are some hazards where we have good repeatable hazard methodologies available that we can apply so it's a defendable, repeatable process? Where do we have national risk data? Some hazards have this information much more widely available than others. Where do we have nationwide structure information of things that are at risk? And how do we bring all of that together in order to actually model our losses? So in thinking about how to do one of these studies, FEMA actually undertook some prior pilot studies of looking at local communities and regions to sort of test out and get under the hood of different methods and models of what are some good approaches, what are some challenging approaches, and for codes especially, what are components of codes or practices represented in codes where we can actually have a modeling framework that can represent and get us to this idea ultimately of having dollars or losses avoided associated with adopting modern codes. So this has really been the first time of looking at all of these things using engineering-based analysis. We'll talk about the HAZUS model in upcoming slides, but also leveraging big data. So when we say big data, what do we mean? So this slide is showing, when we talk about modern codes, we're really talking about post-2000 codes, the ICC, the International Code series that was adopted and started in 2000. That we're taking that date as kind of the date of when modern codes come into place. And to look at construction post-2000 around the country and focusing on where buildings have been built, one of the early trends that we noticed, are the parts of the country where a lot of the growth has been. And if you're familiar with your FEMA regions and your states, the three big ones that really pop out are Florida, California, and Texas. They represent about a third of all post-2000 construction in the U.S. So one of the big data sets that we were able to leverage and what's shown on this page is data from one of the national data contractors, CoreLogic. So they have parcel data for the U.S., represents most of the U.S., about 98% of all parcels in the U.S. So they, as part of this study, data was provided by CoreLogic of the roughly 150 million parcels in the U.S. Around 123 million of those actually have structures of some sort on them. And once we look at attribute data that was also provided and included in from that, roughly 18 million structures were built post 2000. So that 18 million is really what's reflected on these graphs. And so our challenge in this study was to take this data and to see what we could do with it and able to be model our different losses and have the information needed to represent where codes were and weren't adopted. So how is this report set up? So it's really set up around kind of three main topics: getting information about code adoption, the challenges of that, data collection, getting information about structures, also getting information about hazards themselves, and then focusing on three hazards that are part of the hazards modeling framework for flood, hurricane, wind, and earthquake. And you can see on the figure here some of the CoreLogic parcel data from the original data set. So what is our methodology? How does this study work? So the initial is really doing data compilation, gathering our information together. For the hazards modeling, deciding where to focus our efforts. For flood, we had data nationwide, so we were able to do all 50 states and DC. In hurricane-prone areas, so we were able to do the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, also Hawaii. For seismic states, the decision was made to focus on the West Coast, the 3 states there, Utah, Hawaii, and Alaska. Getting information about damage functions, that's what DFs represent there, for pre and post code. So one big thing to remember with this study is what we're trying to compare is the way that a building was built now, which is post code, with what it would have been built or a weaker condition it would have been built to. So that's known as a losses avoided study, where you look at a higher practice and say, well, if we had built this to something weaker, what is that difference between those two conditions? Can I model that? And then can I actually turn that into a dollar estimate to say, hey, this house on an average year can avoid this much damage because it was built to this higher standard. So our methodology is to run this through hazards-based approaches and then evaluate some of the results. So one of the big things among all three hazards was to try to get consistent nationwide building code adoption information. The ICC and also BSEGS provided that. So BSEGS is a national rating service that goes in and looks at local adoption of code, looks at both strengthening and weakening of that code, gives relative scores based on that in again, a consistent, repeatable fashion. Also looks at adoption dates of codes. So these ICC and BSEGS were some of our big initial sources of code information. But then we also had to do gap filling. I'll talk about a little bit later. For our flood and freeboard, we had to actually supplement from the community rating system because at times freeboard and certain building practices aren't fully reflected in just code adoption. Sometimes there's other ways and practices that these things get adopted in. So all three hazards had this gap filling, and then also leveraged local information and local practices, doing things like surveys of local contractors, looking at the standard practices that are done and building that into then the representations of buildings that then go ultimately into the hazards model. So what do we find in some of our early trends? So we did some initial modeling in California and in Florida. There's a 3-page pamphlet that's available through the FEMA website, and we'll give you that address at the end of the talk that can show some of those preliminary results. Some of the trends that we saw, some were expected, such as in Florida with flood and hurricane, that the more urban, the areas that have had higher growth are seeing the relative higher losses, also up in the panhandle. In California, what's interesting is when we combine the flood and the seismic, is that the seismic losses, are along where you picture where the faults are, so kind of one county in from the coast. But then you can see in the upper part of the state, the Sacramento area comes up as a hot spot solely from flood because of the flood risks that are in the area. So those are some interesting initial trends that we had there. The other, in just looking at how much loss is associated with these code adoptions, is that when you compare and you look at some of these values in a relative sense from hazard to hazard, you can see in California that the total dollar amounts are roughly the same, 44 million to 42 million, but the number of structures that were actually modeled to contribute to that are drastically different, with only 25,000 for flood versus close to almost 400K for earthquake. For hurricane wind and flood in Florida, you can see there where the relative count to dollars is about the same, but in Florida, you have a smaller percentage of structures in the floodplain, where with hurricane wind, almost every structure has some level of hurricane wind higher code standard, which then translates into a losses avoided associated with it. So some interesting initial findings that we had from those first few states that we did. So with that as kind of a big picture overview, I wanted to spend some time and take you into, with this being ASFPM, some of the flood specific results and modeling that we did. So the big thing for flood is we had our focus on freeboard. And a lot of people say, well, you know, there's a lot of other code provisions in addition to freeboard. One of the big reasons we focused on that, one is that data was available on a nationwide basis, but freeboard actually also is indicative of other practices as well. So we may not have a database nationally of, let's say, elevated utilities, but if a building is elevated, has, let's say, 1 or 2 foot of freeboard, it's likely that the utilities are also elevated as well. So it's almost an indicator of other practices that we can't directly measure or have direct data sources about. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we estimated freeboard levels, both at the community and across the nation, trying to also look at when things are adopted. Then our flood information. Nowadays, you think, well, we've got good flood boundary information. And that's true. We've got, you know, most of the country now is fully digital. There's a few areas that are still getting filled in. But we also need, as part of this modeling, flood profile information. So not just one return period, but multiples. How do we approximate that? How do we get that information and have some confidence that we have good estimates of that? And then the big thing for hazards-based approaches are these damage functions. For flood, it's depth damage functions. How do we relate a water level in a structure to a damage level? How do we do that on a consistent basis? And then how do we take all this stuff and put it together and do the math? So again, the big assumption and the focus with our with and without code is this idea of freeboard. So the yellow structure there on the left represents how buildings with the higher freeboard or the postcode condition should be built. So it should be built where you have the freeboard represent and the base flood elevation in a given area. Our condition of without the code or pre-code would then be a building simply at the BFE, simply at the 1% annual chance event. So that's our delta. That's our basis by which we're doing our calculations. Now, the challenge with freeboard is that it doesn't come to us only from adoption at a state level or a local level of the I-codes. There can be other ways, such as statewide codes, such as just local code adoption. Many of you here probably are, you know, familiar with how localities adopt their floodplain ordinances. It can come through a variety of different ways, from the subdivision ordinance to a standalone ordinance to, you know, there's probably 10 different flavors of ways that community can adopt and be part of the NFIP. Well, freeboard adoption has this many paths to a similar result type of thing as well. So our data sources and the way that we had to build our information also had to take this into account. So we looked at sources from the ICC and state level information. We also looked at the community rating system. So the CRS, as part of their ratings for communities, actually has freeboard specific codes in there that allowed us to come up with some estimates of freeboard levels as supplemental data to the information that we would have at a state level. And then in some cases, we had local data. So in some cases, states like Florida actually provided us their database with adoption. Texas, their state ASFPM branch, does surveys of freeboard. We were able to leverage that. So we had a handful of states where we actually had some local data, either about directly freeboard adoption or from BSEGs about local code adoption that we could build in. All right, so what does this look like around the country? So let me take you through a bunch of figures. So this is our best available data shot, and I'm going to take you through the first couple of years, again starting in 2000. And you'll notice as the years scroll by, these first couple of years, you're not going to see much difference. That's really a data quality limitation question. So all of our data sources in the early 2000s didn't have a whole lot of variations. But once we start getting to 2004, you can see in given states and areas how you'll have a community pop up with either a change in freeboard, or like in 2006, where we've added New York and then New Jersey in 2007. You can see Florida filling in over time as well, as more and more communities adopt freeboard or actually decide to adopt a higher standard over time. So this patchwork, we got Rhode Island kicking in there in 2011. 2012, you can see more communities fill in. 2013, almost all of Florida and a couple counties in Hawaii come in. 2014, you have Colorado. And then 2015 is a really important year because starting with the 2015 International Residential Code, the IRC, having mandatory freeboard for both riverine and coastal, as communities adopt the 2015 code series and now the 2018, which also kept the freeboard as well, you'll see more and more states actually have statewide. So you notice here in 2017, a number of states went to statewide. Notice Florida now is pretty much completely in, South Carolina as well. And then our study went up to 2018 to include, you can see California now is also a statewide as well. So a lot more extensive coverage from in 2018 than where we are now. So as we built and brought together all of this data, this is one of our challenges, is representing the data and doing it in a consistent fashion. So in the final report, we're going to have maps such as this showing the adoption history, trying to put things in broad groups. So you notice that some states had statewide, even when we had that very first map in 2000, others added in as we went. Others are still the kind of the patchwork with only local communities having freeboard. Another thing to note is there are some states that have adopted modern codes, states like North Carolina and Louisiana, but they've actually weakened the code requirements and taken out the freeboard as a statewide mandate. So there's communities within those states that do have freeboard, sources like CRS show that to us, but they don't have the statewide requirements as many of the other states that have adopted statewide IRC. So we have another thing in the report is we'll have summary tables showing specifically at the state level, this mix and match of things. Also, in terms of communities, looking at the FEMA community layer, how many have or don't have freeboard when we combine everything together. So trying to give some compilation of this information. All right, so that's freeboard, nationwide adoption, our best guess at that. I talked earlier about floodplain boundaries, but then the need to also have flood profiles. So this idea that we need to have a reasonable way to estimate flood elevations at different levels. So one of the things that we leverage, this idea of what are called PELV curves or probability of elevation curves, is actually the basis for a lot of flood insurance in the current setup. And what the values mean, you'll notice here, like V15 or A12, those numbers actually represent the slope of the channel or the relative elevations of different flood events. So what we were able to do is leverage, FEMA released some redacted policy information for the entire US. So we did a data mining exercise where we took that policy information, turned it into unique policies, and then found those policies that actually had PELV curve information, and then derived a data set at the census tract level. The tables shown here are summarized up at the state level for both A zones for riverine and also V zones in coastal areas. But we were able to actually look at, in these different geographic jurisdictions, the ranges of values, kind of a median or an average value, that 50th percentile type of thing, that allows us to then model multiple return periods for a given site as part of our loss calculations. The final step in to be able to do the flood modeling are depth damage functions. So these relate the height of water in a structure to the percent damage to the structure. Traditional depth damage functions are gathered over time in post-event settings, but the challenge with them is they're not really consistent. You'll have one set of curves from one event and you compare them to another and they'll overlap, and they're just logically not following what you would expect to see. So working jointly with some work being done right now with FEMA's coastal team, we were able to develop a new, kind of a new family of curves that gave us consistency in kind of three main ways. If you look at this figure for residential 1-story, you can see the comparison of that lowest yellow curve represents a riverine condition. The highest curve represents a coastal high wave. But you'll notice that all of these curves are consistently going up. They don't overlap. So there's internal consistency, what I'm saying here, within a type. We also have consistency between types, meaning if I compare the residential 1-story with 2-story, I'm going to be seeing trends that I would expect to see. A 2-story being less damaging than a 1 is the expectation. And then if I compared residential to comparable things of other occupancies, such as business or industrial, I also have that relative comparison that's following what the expectations are having been seen out in the field. So it's this whole family of curves that are internally and externally consistent that provides us then modeling results that then follow what we would expect to see. So we take all these things, we put them together, and what do we end up seeing? So we've got our flood depth pelv curves, our depth damage curves, we run them through our models, and we end up getting losses. So it's just some initial flood loss projections. As Jonathan was saying, we're still running through our final numbers. We're going to have, right now it looks like we're going to have roughly around 800,000 post-2000 structures in the floodplain, roughly half of those, around 400,000 with freeboard. Our top states do mirror some of the states with the high construction, but also impact, you notice the Carolinas and New Jersey there, coastal areas with relatively higher flood risks. Another thing we've noticed is that when we condense our results down to county levels, in some cases, we're going to have some counties and areas that don't have losses. Why is that? In some cases, it's data gaps. We actually don't have data. In other cases, when we go through, let's say there's not a lot of post-2000 construction, or they're proactive communities and they don't have a lot of construction in the floodplain. Or maybe they did have construction in the floodplain, but they didn't have freeboard. All those things lend to having a no data or a low loss result. You have to have all those things come together in order, to have some losses avoided. So our next steps, we're finished up the analysis for all the hazards over the summer. We're going to be finalizing a report as well. It's going to be available at the website shown here. If you just do a Google search at FEMA's website for building code save, it'll take you there. And then we've got some follow-up future studies where we want to do enhancements, look at uncertainty. I'll look at some sensitivity as well. So for more information, you can contact the FEMA Building Science Hotline. Also, as part of this virtual ASFPM this year, there's a building science booth where you can also get more information. So thanks very much, and thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Jonathan and Shane, for that presentation. I really appreciate y'all diving into this topic. We have a ton of questions, so we're going to jump right into them. So you've got a lot of community officials, counties and cities that are reluctant to adopt higher building codes because of the public backlash. And then you've got citizens who are more concerned with how much do I have to pay today versus long term. So how do you approach that and battle that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we really hope to get at with this study. So, oftentimes communities don't have this information. They don't understand the long-term benefits of adopting stronger codes, and all they're hearing is sort of one side of the story. So this study is going to give us data on the other side of the story to help them be able to message to the public and their constituents that despite the potential incremental increase in upfront costs, that there are significant benefits in terms of damage reduction and in many cases insurance premium reduction as well. We understand that the the public generally doesn't understand a whole lot about building codes as it is, much less what building codes communities have adopted. And we hope that some of our partners will also be able to use the results from our study to not only inform the public, but inform those community decision makers. So really what this study is going to do is going to give those decision makers sort of the other half of the story, right? So instead of just hearing about how expensive it is to add, a foot of freeboard or add a couple feet of freeboard, they're going to understand the financial benefits of doing that too, so they can make sort of a balanced decision on what's best for their community.
Okay, great. And then another question, a set of questions came in from Stephanie and Jennifer. Did you look at future conditions to look at more lifespan versus sets of the building code? And did you look at resilience codes in this?
So I can talk a little bit about some of the future conditions considerations on this. One thing in all this study is, we took a snapshot in time of where our floodplains are, and there's a lot of the future conditions, both with increased impervious, but also with changing weather conditions and other things. We know that today's 100-year might be the future's 50-year in some cases. And one of the things is that this study kind of gives us a lower bound. So if the actual building is built at, let's say a restudy is done and that base flood actually goes down to the 50-year, we would actually expect a higher amount of losses avoided than on those structures, because you're actually protecting it with that additional foot or 2 feet with freeboard, but you're actually protecting it from more frequent events. So that actually ends up giving you more area under the curve, and it's actually a higher dollar amount. So what we have here is just that beginnings of that discussion of over time as conditions change, or as higher standards come into place. We're expecting this per year to add up and cumulatively get to the point where pretty much anything that's built in a floodplain is going to have those additional higher benefits than what we've got in this initial study.
Okay.
And then with resilient codes, I'll just real quick, one of our challenges here is finding data, and this focus, at least on flood, was on freeboard. There's a lot of other practices that I think, as we do follow-up studies, we want to look at of how best to put dollars to some of those things. One of the challenges, like in coastal areas, is we know things like elevated utilities, breakaway walls, a lot of different practices are part of the higher standards and codes. How do we give dollars to that? How do we represent it? Where do we find data for that? So a lot of these depth damage functions we have now, it's kind of a best guess of all those features together. So when you see a depth damage function in a coastal area, it already kind of has pre-built in. Yeah, we assume that they're elevating those utilities, but if they hadn't, then the damages would have been higher than what we're representing there. So how do we tease that out and include it in, at the same time knowing that our depth damage functions are kind of coarse measurements? And as you saw in the presentation, we had to come up with new ones just to have consistency among everything, that actually having field measured from experience. You think we're getting those with each of our events, but we really don't. It's one of those holes that we have to go out and have comprehensive data collection kind of back up a lot of what assumptions we have in our models now.
Okay. And that ties really directly into one of the other questions, which was, are there rating decreases in flood insurance for updated building codes, similar to how ISO does BSEGs? And like you talked about, we're looking at that. So how did your results, Shane, compare to the loss avoidance study that was done for Colorado communities?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit familiar with that. So other losses avoided studies sometimes will look at specific mitigation measures or specific practices. So I would say, similar to the previous answer, I think on freeboard adoption alone, the trends are similar, but I know that Colorado study included a lot of other measures of losses avoided. And so I think this is a subset of some of the things that they did, but even like in their studies where mitigation action might reduce flood levels, then is the mapping that we're using, we used one snapshot in time, but if we had a way to have the mapping over time, then we would actually be able to better represent what's in the floodplain and what things were built to as well. Some of the things actually Manny had talked about in the previous talk as well, of understanding what was the standard at the time that something was constructed.
Gotcha. When we got time for one more question here. Jonathan, I guess I'll throw it to you. Does better data really win the attention of the decision makers? Stephanie's asking, and versus the dollars the developers are bringing in, and how do you hit that battle?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I had a crystal ball that would tell me definitively what the answer is there, but I feel like everything's going to start with better data, right? This gives us the foundation to back up the recommendations that we're making, and we know that the other side's got a lot of data and a lot of information that they're providing. And so what we're hoping is that we can come to the table with similar data to back up the recommendations that we think communities and states should be doing in terms of codes. It's a constant tension that we're in there, but we really feel that if we can, when we show that the significant benefits of these codes in terms of avoided losses from disasters, that it's going to be a compelling argument for communities to adopt those higher standards.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much for presenting. A lot of this data sounds like it's going to tie in directly to some of the other questions, which are related to what about outside of the floodplain? Where do you go from there? So that rabbit trail. But Jonathan, Shane, thank you so much. And we're going to move on to the next presentation.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, everyone.
All right, so our next presenter is Jennifer Wellock. She's with the National Park Service, and she is the technical reviewer for new guidelines on flood adaptation. And Jennifer is going to be presenting on why is elevating, she's going to be looking at new guidelines on flood adaptation. She's the senior technical reviewer for the National Park Service. Sorry, the questions versus her title got mashed together there. So Jennifer, welcome to the stage.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Wellock, and I'm a technical reviewer with the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division of the National Park Service. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me. This is the first time I've attended this conference, and I'm really looking forward to all the presentations. Today, I'll be talking to you about a document I wrote along with two of my colleagues at the National Park Service, Jennifer Eggleston and Jenny Parker. All three of us work together. We have different roles and we're in different departments, but we all work within the Cultural Resources Division. Our guidelines are basically about flood adaptation and rehabilitating historic buildings. Now, why is the Park Service here? The Park Service is perhaps best known because of our national parks that you know and love, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, maybe Yosemite. But we also do a lot of external program activity. I've given you a link here of our external programs, and they include things like land and water grants, programs to identify historic resources, and a lot of those things are within the National Park Service Cultural Resources Directorate, where I work. Preservation assistance, grants to states and tribes. We also have departments that are devoted to technical assistance, which is the Technical Preservation Services branch. That will oversee the guidance documents like the one I'm sharing with you today. Why did we wind up in the flood world? Well, we were given a lot of money after a few disasters. So after Katrina and Sandy, Congress appropriated several millions of dollars and gave it to the National Park Service and the State, Tribe, Local Plans and Grants Division to manage. And we were there tasked to give it away to states to preserve historic resources. And it was one of the times when we had to deal with homeowners. Previously, we had done grants to nonprofits, to educational institutions, and to governmental entities. But this was the first time we were dealing with homeowners, and it was new for us, to be honest. And we were educating them and educating ourselves at the same time about the reality of how to do recovery, the rules that surrounded the issues, and also the many demands on property owners once they have experienced a flood event. We had to actually develop grant guidance based on this because we didn't have it. We had typical things about coastal planning and resilience, but this was the first time we really had to go to the individual and say, what we would accept and what we would not accept in the programs and what we would fund. And that's really where it began. We realized that we probably needed even more than just these specific topics. This was a bigger issue. And that's when we explored doing something called a preservation brief. And I'll get into the guidance documents as we go along here. The background is that the Secretary's standards for the treatment of historic properties come from the National Historic Preservation Act, which was passed in 1966. And in that document, the Secretary of the Interior is given a role and is asked to create a specific technical guidance that is to be shared with our federal partners and external partners. So the Secretary's standards for the treatment of historic properties, they're just one type of standards. We have other ones: how to evaluate historic resources, how to preserve archaeology. But in this case, I'm going to be focused on the treatment standards. There are 4 treatment standards. The first is restoration, which is where you bring a building back to a specific point in time. Preservation, where you're kind of keeping all the elements there and you're going to preserve the building as it is, showing the passage of time. Reconstruction, where something might be missing and you bring it back based on documentation. And rehabilitation, where you're going to add new types of systems, maybe new heating and air or new accessibility to the building in order to bring it up to code, but you still want to retain its historic resources. The 4 treatment standards have a lot of inherent recommended approaches and not recommended. So the Park Service began to produce guidelines that would tell folks exactly how they should go about doing these standards. The standards are kind of high-level philosophical approaches, in a way, do no harm, but the guidelines give you the more, well, what does that mean when I'm dealing with adding a new addition, or what does that mean when I need to fix the masonry? Underneath the guidelines are preservation briefs. Right now we have about 50 at the Park Service preservation briefs, and those deal with a topic that might be adobe, how to preserve it. Masonry buildings, what kind of mortar mix should I use depending on the age of the property? What sort of concrete issues might there be if I add Portland cement or not? And really, for us, we thought a preservation brief would be the right place to go for flooding guidance, because it is very complicated and it needs a bit of background. You've got different types of flooding, how it's regulated, what communities might need to know, what a homeowner would need to know, how to record properties correctly. So the brief seemed like the right topic. And interpreting the standard bulletin, that's more of a specific guidance, like might be how to add garage doors to industrial buildings. And tech notes are very techy, obviously, where you're learning how to do a storefront window correctly. So for us, we thought, well, a preservation brief will get to the heart of the issue of flooding. To start that, we put together a bunch of flood workshops where we discussed the issues with our colleagues in the state and local governments. We went to 4 different locations, and we were really looking at control, all the different types of issues. We wanted to see examples in the field and find out how the world at large was handling these. And what came out of it was our partners at the states and tribal level did not want a brief right now. They needed a more concrete, yes, no, recommended, not recommended treatment approach, because we've had so many storms and there's so much happening right now in this field. And so by the late 2017, we had kind of pushed aside the guidance of the preservation brief and moved on to this document, a guidance document that would give people an idea of what would be acceptable under the rehabilitation standard. By August of 2019, we had actually have a draft. We gave that to our National Park Service colleagues for review, as well as to our federal partners such as FEMA and HUD. And we learned a lot through this process. Our state and local partners are tribal partners. Everyone was very good, and I really can't tell if any of you participated in the review. We appreciated it. We wanted to make sure that what we were presenting to the world was A, understandable, and B, relevant. So the complexity and scale of the challenge really needed, we needed this wider audience for the review. If you've not seen the guidelines in the past, this on the right side here on the bottom is actually the cover document of the most updated version of the 4 treatment standards guidelines. So those restoration, rehabilitation, preservation, and reconstruction each then have guidance under it. And I'm showing you here the guidelines for rehabilitation for masonry. And they always have a recommended and a not recommended. They're flexible. They're supposed to apply to all sorts of building types. They're a best practice, but they're not case specific. And you'll see they have a kind of a quirk. They always start with an ing. So it's protecting and maintaining. And then on the other side, failing to maintain. Now the flooding guidance, as we approached it, we realized we couldn't kind of organize it in the exact same way. We didn't have just the same kind of method to organize. So we weren't looking at just masonry or the porticos or how to add ramps. We were looking at the risk and then the adaptation. So you'll see they were organized a little bit differently. This is the cover of it. And we do have a lot of introduction. And that is what we realized. The folks that might use this may not have any idea of what the standards are, where they come from, what are these rehabilitation things. But we want to make sure to link it to those programs that we offer financial assistance to, make sure that they will meet those guidelines. So rehabilitation standards are often the one used in grant projects. They're not the only one, but they are one of them. And we also use the rehabilitation standards when we review federal tax credit projects for historic rehabilitation. So it's good to kind of link these things in the document so folks understand the implications if they follow them. And we didn't organize the chapter in a particular fashion after this, because really, which one is more important than the other? It would depend on the type of flood, where you are, how often it happened, what your resources are. We did think about planning as the first one, because you should probably plan before you do any of these activities. But then after that, they're in no order. They probably, temporary might have the least impact to a property, but maybe it doesn't do enough. Maybe it keeps the property in risk status. But I do, as one of the authors and with my colleagues, we beg you to read the introduction, because you have to understand the basic premise of these guidelines, which is there must be a risk of flood to use them. So you can't pick up this set of guidelines to add a kitchen to your house that's perfectly safe. These are a little more flexible, they're a little more specific, and they relate to flood risk. So you can only really use them appropriately when there is such a risk. And that gets us to our next sort of how they work. Inside each, you'll see there's an introduction to the measure. The people here, you all know what these things mean when I say temporary protection, but many of my colleagues do not. So we go through what that is. It's a sandbag, it's a floodgate. And then we talk about the technical limitations and list the different conditions that might be necessary to implement the treatment. Then we go into the recommended and not recommended style. So here again, you see selecting a temporary barrier is is a recommended approach, and then selecting something that's a system that's incompatible is not recommended. So that is the general gist of it. That's how they work. It's our best advice, and it deals only with buildings. So while we understood that there are issues about mitigation of flood risks with archaeology and with landscapes, this document is based on buildings only. And maybe when we get back to the brief, we'll talk more about those other elements, because I do think they're important. And I do want to say, we didn't cover other people's program areas. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency is in charge of the flood the National Flood Insurance Program, we did not talk about it too much in this document because that would be something we would discuss at length in the brief. But here, that's not really what this is about. This is about treatments that we can do that we think will preserve the character of a historic property. And so really, how are you going to go about planning to do this? For a historic property, you probably want to know why it's being preserved in the first place. So what makes it significant? What's the big deal about this issue? What happened there maybe is important. Was it a place where there was a civil rights rally? Maybe it's its great design. Was it designed by a great architect, or does it just show a vernacular style, a log cabin? Maybe it's a bunch of resources together that make up an important story, like a beach community that was put together after the flu pandemic in 1918. So there might be existing characteristics of that building that we should note that have inherent resilience. So those beach houses may have storm shutters. We think of them as kind of part of the beachy character, the sitting out, propped up wooden shutters, but they have a role and they're doing something we might want to preserve, as well as they're also helping the risk of that property being so close to the seaside. So identifying the type of risk is another issue. You've got to figure out what sort of flood you're having. Is it a nuisance flood? Is it something that happens once a month with the tide? Is it something that's a once in a lifetime event? Or is it, looking down the road, maybe there's some erosion happening in your community and your house is going to be much closer to the sea than it was at one time, where the riverine flooding has gotten quite extreme with climate change. So take a look at those things and identify the actual vulnerability and risk, and if there's any existing capacity, and then begin to think about adaptation. When we are looking at this document, a lot of times we have to describe what each of these things mean to folks that are not so savvy as yourselves with floods and management of them. So I realize I don't have to go through that with you all, but I did want to show you some of the concerns that we would think about. So something like protect utilities, pretty simple, but for us, maybe the design of that platform. Should you paint it? Is it not painted? What about the height? Where is it tied to the building? And if you did put it inside, would you put it in a main space or a secondary space? We would recommend a secondary space. So in these two instances, I would definitely say the bases probably should have been painted just based on the character there. And maybe they could have been screened in some fashion. So we want to talk about whatever we do, we want to start at the most bang for our buck. We'd like to get the best protection, but also preserve the resource to the best of our ability. And oftentimes, there is no perfect solution, and we recognize that you might have to combine different types of activities to get a perfect adaptation, and also that there may not be money to do a lot. So something as simple as protect utilities, that might be a first step for a property owner. More ambitious projects might be dry floodproofing, and in these, for the technical considerations, we would be worried about the waterproofing aspect in the middle photo. Adding materials to something below grade is necessary to keep the building watertight, but what will that do to, say, soft brick built in the 19th century, or how will it be attached? Will it be applied? Will it be put on with a sealant, kind of a coating, or will it be affixed with some sort of bolting system? All of those will have impacts. If it's on a coastal area, there might be rusting impacts as well. On the left side, we have someone who's trying to design in the style of a historic storefront, but incorporating some floodproofing characteristics. This is a project in Texas, and there are limitations here. I mean, this was, at the time when it was built, considered to be high enough, but after Harvey, those walls were topped. So now they're coming back in for a new design. So dry flood proofing may not be appropriate in some areas now that we know the height of the water is coming in higher than 3 feet. On the right side is actually an English example, the stone cottage, and that has a flood gate. And I mean, that masonry construction is probably strong enough to withstand the flood forces, but something not so substantial, we'd have to look at the pressures and how it was connected to the ground, and whether or not there would be any way to get the water out that seeped in, because it always does. So there's those issues we go through in the guidance. Wet floodproofing, allowing water in, is problematic because oftentimes we may have in an older property spaces underground that are quite significant. So an early kitchen, to say. So the idea that all the things at the lower level aren't important is not necessarily true. Again, we're going back to that planning, what makes this building important. Here you can see where just different types of venting can really contribute to the overall success of a project. We have some historic looking vents. They're actually new in a New Orleans project on the left. And then you have more, run-of-the-mill square vents that are on a facade that's also brick. And you could see how the ones on the right might be, depending on how many you needed. And if it was on a very prominent facade, this might be something that couldn't really work for a historic property. So maybe we need to go to something with a little more design. Sometimes there is built-in resilience to the historic property. I put this in because it is one of my favorites. This is one of the steamboat houses in the lower ninth of New Orleans, and it was built to flood. And so you see you come in at an elevated platform, and then at that level, it's all tiled. And then there are tiles on the wall, as well as cypress wood that can be hosed down, and you can get water back in there, and made sure to start again. And it has flooded numerous times. So it's not always a new thing. Sometimes the building itself may have some characteristics, but I recognize this is a special property. We talk about things like filling the basement and how that works in the city of Baltimore. Fells Point is talking about that. Whether or not you have rental opportunities down below and you don't want to lose that, but on the street side, hard to see any difference. And it does take away a lot of the risk of loss at the lower level. As long as you move any utilities and things up above the flooding, I think this is a very successful adaptation method particularly for connected buildings, but you must of course have a basement to be eligible for this, and that's not always the case. You're all familiar with elevating on a new foundation, so I don't have to explain it too much. For us, while this is a common solution, it is done in so many different ways, and you've seen good examples and bad examples. So I think what we discovered as we went through was the change in height really depended on the mass of the building, how it was sort of disguised below, whether or not it had screening like the example in the middle, or if it was left open. How was the access treated? You see in that same example in the middle, the door no longer actually has a stair there. It's a balcony because we had to create a new stair. And anytime you have constrained lots, you can't add too many stairs to something. You've got to have a building that's structurally stable enough to be able to go in the air. And anything that's done underneath really has to be thought about. Oh, sorry. If you look here, this type of building, though, is not conducive to being separated. So this is something like falling water and designed by Frank Lloyd Wright to incorporate the landscape. There is no way that elevation is really going to work here. But our guidelines do recognize that it can work for properties, making sure to mask the breakaway screening at the bottom, trying to maintain access points, not using the new open area for parking underneath that's visible. I'll go through and happy to take some questions at the end about this, but I do think sometimes it is just not going to work for a certain resource, like a special one like falling water. I think we'll see more of this as we have more storms along the eastern seaboard and along the southern Gulf Coast. elevating the interior structure of commercial buildings might be the way to keep them open and commercially operable, yet you do need to worry about the floor to ceiling height. So you have to have sufficient space to lose some footage down below. And you also have to worry about access. So you'll see the caution, watch your step. That's because you are coming in and going up 3 stairs in the St. Augustine example I'm showing. We are worried in our guidance, we discuss a domino effect. So if you had a floor to ceiling that wasn't sufficient, you might bump the floor above and bump the floor above that. We want the windows and the floors to sort of match up in the best way that we can. So that is something, if we did have to move the new floor in that example on the left, we would want to hold it back from the window so it was very obvious to the public as they walked by. You might have to abandon the whole first story. I put this in, this is another example from the Baltimore Fells Point, where you see they've left the front on the left, you see the brick building there, and they're actually using the access still, but they're going right up to the 2nd floor. On the back side, you can see that that 1st floor has become parking. So that's the same building, but at the rear. This isn't going to work everywhere. They had changed a little bit of a slope, but I could see where this would be something you might see when people they just cannot make that interior space work, and it just becomes non-usable. Moving in preservation world is considered kind of taboo, but when you go through the different options and you're still in the flood risk, this might be what you have to do. And when we did our flood workshops, we found that in the Midwest, this was not seen as very difficult, but on the East, it's a little harder because there's not as much land available. And so where do you take it out of you can't move it unless you're going to make it safe, really, in our guidance. And I put these 2 examples in because they're both from Ellicott City in Maryland, and they are houses that have both suffered storms and moved. The one on the right is a masonry building, and of course, very difficult to move, but it was hit by Agnes. And maybe the move itself is part of the story now, but it was trucked up out of town. And then on the left, the log cabin, actually that's a recent news story, they've just actually moved it back down into Ellicott City after the flood. So it has moved a few times. And I think, when you do a move, you always have to, if it is listed on the National Register, you always have to talk to the State Historic Preservation Office as you do this, because they'll give advice about where they think it might work best for the landscape, what has a good relationship to the property, how it should be oriented on its new site, and really what you might have left behind about the archaeology and other things at the original site. We don't have a lot, but we do talk about some unconventional treatments that are experimental. There right now, prototypes such as buoyant foundations or hydraulic lifts for historic properties. We are a natural resource agency as well as a cultural agency, so we do talk about bringing water back into areas, using new kinds of environmental protections that might be reestablishing canals or doing water retention areas or living shorelines. So we don't have a lot there, but we wanted to include it because we know this is an ever-evolving field. And demolition, which, sad face, I do not, of course, nobody could recommend it as a preservation treatment ever, but we do know it is a reality. And we'd like to make sure that these buildings are documented before they're lost, and perhaps some parts are salvaged. So we do give advice about that and how they could be planned for if there's a buyout zone where it might be. So I think it's evaluating all the feasible alternatives first before deciding to demolish, obviously, is where we would go. But then whether or not you can document it, maybe 3D drawings or architectural drawings. We are going to have an illustrated version, I promise you. It's coming in late 2020. Here's the link for the current version. You can print it off. But I did want to say I know photos will help a ton in understanding some of our recommended and not recommended approaches. And we are going to keep testing with the Army Corps some traditional materials. We started that project a few years back where we tested assemblies under an ASTM test. And now we're going to go back and test individual materials, which kind of makes it more in keeping with the current way that flood resistance for modern materials is evaluated. And we're looking forward to those final results coming soon. Well, I want to thank you for having me. And here's our link to our flood adaptation page at the Park Service. I'm happy to answer any questions. And again,
Thank you, Jennifer, for that presentation. And Jennifer Wellock, not Wellock, as I was saying. So
that's fine.
I appreciate you diving into this topic with us. We have several really good questions and a couple are going to put you on your toes, I think. So Wayne's asking, can the State Historic Preservation Office overrule these guidelines by being more strict?
So it depends, I guess. One of the reasons would be if you're doing a state rehabilitation tax credit, they typically use the National Park Service as their baseline. If you're doing a federal rehabilitation tax credit, yes, they have to use these guidance. This is the guidance. If you're doing a state grant, they might have other issues. Maybe there's a stricter law there. But if you're doing a National Park Service funded grant program, like we have some emergency funds right now for Hurricane Katrina, and we had some for Sandy, and now we have some for Harvey, Irma, Maria. So you have to use these. So these are the rules.
Gotcha. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to pay for them to go above the standards. Gotcha.
That's right.
So there was a question about where to download the guide, but it's on your slide there, which is fantastic.
The last slide.
So another one is Jonathan Westcott is paying you back for the question you put on him during his presentation.
Well deserved. Well deserved.
Okay. The guidance is great. Does it incorporate or reference any of the available FEMA guidance for some of these measures?
So we were cautious of that. We do have it. It's kind of at the back. We have a reference section. Not that that means anything, but we didn't want to step on FEMA's toes and kind of give the impression that our document was at all theirs. We did use it extensively when we went through to see what would be eligible and how kind of the terms are described, actually: floodproofing, wet floodproofing, dry floodproofing. So we definitely used it. And when we do the brief soon, it is one of the references, definitely.
Okay. And Christine's wondering, would you recommend this guide just for buildings on the National Register, or is it more broadly applicable?
Personally, I think it's good for older buildings in general, just as kind of a thought process. You know, it's evaluate the risk, check to see what's out there, maybe take a status of what the building is right now. And it doesn't matter really to me if you're on the historic register, but it's intended for historic buildings, which means things that are eligible for the National Register or things that are on the National Register. So, okay. But for me, I think all the information in here could be used by anyone with an older home.
Excellent. And speaking of which, Elisa is asking, do you have a good examples of dry floodproofing for historic buildings besides just seal the brick?
Right, which is always terrifying. Well, in our guidance, we talk about a couple of things. Like, first off, the structural considerations, you know, making sure the little building can handle what's happening, anchoring it appropriately. We talk about site drainage. So there's a little bit of that. And like I know we need photos of all of these things, and that's what's happening, that's coming this fall. But in terms of coverings and coatings, I've seen some interesting ones. We were down in Mandeville on a site visit, and they did have kind of like a temporary, but it was bolted into the brickwork at the base flood elevation all the way around the building, sort of like a wrap, painted. Okay. Couldn't tell the difference between the building and the wrap. And it can be removed, you know, if we need to do it, but it's there to protect the commercial level. So,
okay.
Example, we'll have pictures.
Yeah.
But if you have good pictures, you know, feel free to email me as well.
Yeah, well, and Jonathan's asking, are there considerations for changing the drainage of the site, like drainage improvements at all? And you had mentioned.
Yeah, the drainage issue. I mean, once you're going with the drainage, I mean, we talk mostly about buildings in here, but we have to acknowledge there's archaeological impacts a lot of times. And when we're a lot of drainage and things like that, we really need to kind of check first with locality to see if they know of any known sites, and maybe it needs a little bit more kind of finesse, you know, at that location.
Okay. And it looks like the link for this guide is the mps.gov/TPS/standards/rehabilitation/flood-adaptation.
Yes, it's a long one. Well, you know, it's government, so we have to make you pay for get to that link. So.
Yeah, so it's in the chat there, but if for those of you who can speak Southern, you can hear what I just said and you'll get it later.
Yeah.
I guess that wraps up the questions. Everybody just wants a copy and they're asking for the links, but yes, the presentations are available online after this and good to
Yes.
go.
Oh, thank you very much. Enjoyed everybody's presentation today.
Well done. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you everybody for joining us with this session. Once again, thank you Atkins for sponsoring this session. And please stick around for the next couple of days for our great conference. And don't forget the happy hour that's going on in 30 minutes. Is it 30 minutes? Yeah, which is a trivia happy hour. So I'm going to go across the street and get my supplies, but come back and join us for trivia. The link is on the website under the events. And thank you so much to all of our speakers, to Manny, to Jennifer, to Jonathan, and to Shane. And we'll see you tomorrow.